more serious tone. We discussed yesterday the difference in economics between economies of scale, such as those practiced in the factories of Henry Ford. It's called the economies of scale of the Route 128 large corporations that I was mentioning when they produce computers, versus economies of agglomeration. I'm going to summarize what I said because I didn't write it down on the board. Labor in economies of scale is always routine. We saw that. Today we talk about Taylorism, or was that yesterday when we were talking about Marx, right? I think it was yesterday. So Taylorized labor. Wait a second. Oh, I see. In which skills have been replaced by routines. Leadership. This is typically managers. I will explain in a second what this means. Type of competition. Oligopolistic. Prices. Costs plus markup. And there are several other characteristics. I'm not going to list them all. Labor. Skill. Leadership. An entrepreneur. Competition. Anonymous. This oligopolistic rivalry. Finally, prices. Autonomous. In other words, prices set themselves. Here, prices set via pricing power. Now, I'm deliberately dichotomizing this. In reality, we're always going to find mixtures of the two. But it will be better for the point that I'm trying to make if we begin at least by painting the differences in a very stark kind of way, and then we begin drawing some shades of gray between them. Economies of scale are the ones that we know better. Those are the ones that we identify with the Industrial Revolution, and we identify with large-scale mass production. The labor tends always to be routine. We saw that yesterday. Economies of scale, the basic rudiments of economies of scale were born, as I said yesterday, in military arsenals and armories, and it was military discipline. And Taylor learned his techniques from the military. He had friends in armories and arsenals, and so he comes directly from that line. And so the routinization of labor, as I said yesterday, leads to the loss of skills. Because if you don't practice skills, if you don't teach skills by example, they eventually disappear from the worker communities that you are employing. A typical factory or firm operating on economies of scale cannot finance itself from credit from banks. They need to go public. They need to start an initial public offering and then start selling stock or selling bonds. Therefore, there is a separation between ownership and control. This is one reason Marxists took forever to understand public companies, because for Marxists, it was the ownership of the means of production that mattered. That was the key to everything. Everything could stay the same, and as long as the ownership of those machines passed to the government, to a socialist, communist government, everything was just fine. But in these types of, General Motors, Ford, Cisco, Apple, Google, once they go public, ownership and control is separated. Ownership now is in the hands of a bunch of stockholders, can be thousands of them, and the control of the day-to-day operations of a factory are in the hands of a manager. Now, managers don't have to own even a tiny little portion of the company. In fact, they typically are hired guns. They come from other companies where they were executives, and you're just passing them to your own executives. A perfect example here is the transition that Apple, okay, let me just show this, the contrast. Leadership in what is called Economies of Agglomeration. I mentioned Emilia Romagna yesterday as an example. I mentioned Silicon Valley as an example. Leadership in small firms, 20,000 small firms that inhabit Emilia Romagna, is in the hands of entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is the person with the vision, the person who started the business, the person who invested his or her own money, his or her own savings in starting a business with a vision to do something. And because he is the owner and he is the director. So ownership and control are in the same hands. Ownership and control are separated here. And just so that you can see the difference that this makes, think of Apple at the end of the 70s, 1977. It was started, as everybody knows, with $1,300 in a garage. He had 2 employees, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Nobody at the time believed that there could be personal computers. Computers were office machines. So your choice was really between a large IBM computer or smaller mini computers like those manufactured by Digital, One, and DEC. Personal computers. Who's going to need a computer in his desktop? What are they going to do with those personal computers? Persons don't need computers. So it was a new idea by these guys. And they launched it, and it was successful. But 6, 7 years later, right after the first Macintosh had been launched, Apple went public. In other words, it grew large enough that they could not finance itself anymore from just credit from banks. They needed to sell stock. They needed to sell pieces of the company. They needed to sell bonds, which is basically debt of the company that can be sold and exchanged. And they went public. And the moment they went public, Steve Jobs lost all control. They fired him in 1984, and they brought as a new manager to direct Apple an executive whose last job has been the head of Pepsi-Cola. I mean, just so that you can see the absurdity of the situation. A guy whose knowledge is about sodas is supposed to come here and run a company who's producing an entirely new product, which is the personal computer, at a time when it was crucial, because even though the graphic user interface was invented by Xerox, it was Steve Jobs who had made it into an actual stable product that could actually function in people's houses. Today, of course, we're used to the graphics in the graphical interface, but that didn't used to be the case for many times. He took an idea, took some entrepreneur with a vision. Well, they kicked out Steve Jobs, bye-bye, and they hired a manager from Pepsi-Cola. And Apple, of course, began going down the tubes ever since. The only way they were able to recover the wind under their wings was by bringing Steve Jobs back, who didn't invent the iPhone, didn't invent the iPod, didn't invent the iMac, but he was there in charge of the creative team that would do it. Competition. When you have large firms operating on economies of scale, there are typically 3, 4, maximum 5 firms in a particular country. That means that you know your competitors. Your competitors are in fact your rivals. And you make your decisions taking into account what their possible responses will do. So if you're Ford and you decide unilaterally to reduce the prices of your cars by, say, 30%, you have to take into account that Chrysler and General Motors may respond in kind and drop the price 30%, at which point they may force you to drop your prices 40%, which they have to follow, and that creates what is called a price war. Price wars are good for consumers, because we get very cheap stuff, but very bad for the members of an oligopoly. There was a very famous price war at the beginning of the 90s between two manufacturers of personal computers, Compaq and I can't believe which one was the other one. Compaq, they were PCs, right, running Windows. Compaq unilaterally decided to half the price of the personal computers. They were from $2,000 to $1,000, something like that. Everybody had to follow suit. Everybody lost because now the price was too cheap. And Compaq eventually went out of business. I think it was acquired by either Dell or Hewlett Packard. I can't remember right now. In a region like Emilia-Romagna or Silicon Valley, competition is anonymous. I told you yesterday that in Emilia-Romagna there are 20,000 small firms competing against each other in terms of design. Now you cannot possibly know the owners of all those 20,000 firms. At the most, you met 50 of them at the last trade association meeting, and you probably don't remember the names of those guys. You're still competing because everybody's designing, and if your designs are inferior, you're not going to sell as much as the other guys with designs that are superior. But you're not competing against them in the way in which two baseball teams competing against each other. It's anonymous competition. It is not a rivalry. It is the type of competition that Adam Smith spoke of. Finally, when you have 20,000 small firms, prices set themselves. Small firms do not have pricing power. That's a technical term in economics. That is, they do not have the power to decide how much they want to charge. They simply charge the price that is going, the price that set itself. When you're a large corporation, you do have pricing power. You still have to consider about demand and supply, of course. That's going to enter into your costs, your labor costs, your raw material costs, which may have been determined roughly by demand and supply. Although, because you're large, you can twist your supplier's arms to give you the best price possible because you're buying large quantities. I'll buy 20,000 tires for you, but if you reduce the price 70%. I'll buy 100,000 spark plugs from you, but if you reduce the price half. So you can even manipulate a little bit the cost. But the most important part is the markup. A large corporation sets the prices for a particular product by first calculating the costs of raw materials, of labor, of design, of intellectual property, and then adding a markup. And the markup is arbitrary. As they say in that famous movie Wall Street, how much should the markup be? Well, as much as the market can bear. Right? In other words, as much as we can get away with. So prices don't really reflect economic situations, don't really reflect anything. They just reflect economic power, pricing power. Right? That defeats the function of prices. When prices set themselves, they carry information, they carry true information about demand and supply. If all of a sudden, when prices set themselves, prices go down, people know that there might be an oversupply of the particular product that you're thinking about, or that the supply remained the same, but now there's a much lower demand for it. So if prices set themselves, and all of a sudden laptop computers begin to become cheaper, well, you might account that for the fact that the iPad and other tablets are now eating into the demand for laptops, and that's why there's less demand. But it gives you information. If prices set themselves, they help coordinate the economy. They help allocate resources the best way possible, because you can locate where there's higher demand, where is the higher supply. When you set prices via a markup, you're distorting this information. And people cannot take that information into account to make economic decisions. Finally, one more thing that I'm not going to write down here. Large corporations grow sometimes organically, simply by adding more workers to the production line and increasing the amount of production of a particular product. But in many cases, they simply buy smaller firms, right? Just in the way in which Google bought YouTube, or in the way in which eBay bought Skype, or in the way in which Microsoft now is buying Skype, and so on. I mean, there's a million examples of what is called vertical integration. And the reason why is that large corporations like to do everything in-house, prefer to do everything in-house. Small firms do not have neither the size nor the amount of money to actually begin buying things. So they grow mostly organically. But, and this is the key difference that I want to make, that I want to stress right now, 20,000 small firms in Emilia-Romagna cannot move away from Emilia-Romagna. Emilia-Romagna attracts talented people, or Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley attracts talented programmers, attracts talented software designers, interface designers, attracts talented hardware designers, chip makers, and designers of new hard drives, and designers of new types of screens, because they know there's so many firms there. They will find a job. And also, they know that talent will accumulate in that region, and therefore they will have plenty of talk after work, at the pub, at the coffee shop, shop talk, but interesting shop talk, so that you can continue learning all the time from all those talented people around you. But everybody shares that pool of talent, and therefore, no one can move away from Silicon Valley. Right? You move away from Silicon Valley only if you're large enough that you have internalized all those resources, and you can move away with your resources. That's like what Lockheed did when changed from one state to another, and that's what large corporations do. The moment the state government, the local state government, either tries to tax them more, or tries to all of a sudden charge them more for the land that they need to buy in order to create a new factory. Large corporations can in fact blackmail politicians and governments, because they can just say, look, if you increase our taxes, we have 300,000 employees. I'll move, and your 300,000 employees are going to be 300 unemployed, angry voters. Is that what you want? No, please stay. Now, I want to say that ethically, in the Spinozian sense, these types of economic firms create mixtures that are poisonous, that are degrading in a variety of different ways. They degrade labor through de-skilling. This is not something that happens immediately, but happens over several generations. So for instance, the maquiladoras, those factories that are in the northern part of Mexico, I'm sure that the Mexicans that are working there are very happy to have a job. But the maquiladoras simply do routine work. Everything is designed in the United States, and only the routine assembly and the routine production aspects are sent to those maquiladoras. Those Mexicans in that part of Mexico were actually highly skillful. You could see it in their little chashkas that they do for tourists, in the little folk art that they create. You can see it in the way they decorate their houses and in the way they decorate their towns. But when you go there now, all you see is this homogeneous space. Two generations later, they have lost all their skills. The only jobs they can do are routine jobs. We're talking about of course, the daughters and sons of that first generation. And they have lost most of their creativity. So economies of scale degrade labor. Economies of scale degrade leadership. By separating control from ownership, you separate any kind of incentive that the leader will have in having a vision that you're going to promote. Steve Jobs had a vision. Steve Jobs still has a vision. Without Steve Jobs' vision, the iPod wouldn't exist, the iPhone wouldn't exist, the iPad wouldn't exist. This is why, now that he's sick and looks so frail and fragile, and the stock of Apple goes down every time he shows up for one TV presentation, because people look at him as the soul of Apple. And he looks so frail, and he probably died in 3 or 4 years. Will Apple be able to function without Steve Jobs, without that directing vision? Right? But leadership becomes completely degraded once you begin taking managers to be interchangeable cogs in a machine. You bring a manager from Pepsi-Cola to run a computer company. Who does that? Right? What kind of a vision can the Pepsi-Cola guy bring to Apple if he didn't know anything whatsoever about computers? But that is the way executives work. Sometimes you do give them stock options, but that's precisely to align their interests with the interests of the company, right? So that they have at least a little bit of a stake in the company, because without stock options, managers don't have any reason whatsoever, except continuing to draw their salary, to make that firm more creative, more inventive, more adaptive to different situations as technology changes. They have absolutely no incentive. You can give them some stock options, but you give them some stock options and it can backfire, because what they might want to do is now direct the company, create policies for the firm just to inflate the price of the stock so that they enrich themselves, but not necessarily giving direction to the firm in the direction of something more creative, something more interesting, something more artistic. Economies of scale also degrade competition in the sense that they transform it into the kind of rivalry that exists between military establishments or between sports teams. Competition in the sense of Adam Smith was supposed to be an anonymous source of pressure. It was supposed to be, if we're going to compete in terms of design, all you need to know is that there's all these good designers out there that are trying to out-design you, and that anonymous pressure is supposed to be what keeps you motivated to produce better design. But once you begin belonging to an oligopoly, your competition is on the basis of economic power. You start doing things like triggering price wars and creating a bad condition for the industry, something that degrades the industry, something that can actually bankrupt the firms. Finally, as I said, setting prices or having pricing power by adding costs, by adding a markup to costs, degrades the information carrying capacity of prices. If prices do not set themselves, then they do not carry signals as to signals that you can use to perform a better allocation of resources in a society. That's the whole point of prices. The whole point of having a market economy is precisely that prices carry true information about demand and supply, so as to allow firms to make the right decisions with that information. But that information gets degraded, not completely disappears because it's still partly on the costs, but because the costs also reflect economic power. How much were you able to twist the arms of your suppliers so that they would reduce the cost to the minimum, and then because you add an entirely arbitrary markup, the prices set by corporations carry absolutely no information, at least no useful information about supply and demand. An economy run by large firms, particularly international firms, is not a market economy. This is what we were talking about yesterday when I quoted Brodel, and Brodel said we must make an unequivocal distinction between the market economy and capitalism. The market economy and capitalism. There is no market economy without autonomous prices, without prices that actually carry information. Finally, the mobility that vertical integration gives large firms allows them to have the power to kill entire regions simply by moving away from that region, by closing a factory. I think the best example of that type of degradation is that film, what was it called, Flint, about Flint near Detroit.
Roger and me.
Looking for Roger and Me, right? Or Looking for Roger, or something like that. That town, Detroit, of course, is a perfect example of an entirely degraded city that shouldn't be degraded that way. When you try to analyze the causes of that degradation and the apparent impossibility of the Detroit government to actually bring Detroit back to life, you cannot but think that those three parasites that did not care at all about their city, that began just, housing their staff in the suburbs so that they would never have to pass through the city and they would have to never interact with the people in the city, they began to kill the city. They began to degrade the city. Flint is another example because there they simply closed a plant and all of a sudden there were 200,000 people or 100,000 people, I can't remember right now the number, unemployed. You do that and you degrade a town. And in that film you see a town degraded. There's a famous scene where, of course, there's 100,000 people unemployed, so there's 100 potential criminals, right? What else are they going to do? So you build a new prison. And there's a famous scene in that film where all the rich people in town throw a costume party at the prison, right? Remember that? Which is, it almost looked like Fellini, right? Like this Fellini-esque, weird costumes, and all the rich people in town in the prisons playing around in the cells, the day before the prison opened for business. You saw a town gone crazy. You saw a town degraded. Even the rich people in the town had been degrading their minds. Who in his right mind, with unemployment that high, throws a party in a prison? Right? Economies of agglomeration cannot, the firms that belong to economies of agglomeration cannot move from the place where they are. In the sense that Silicon Valley attracts talent, and economies of firms operating in economies of agglomeration need a skilled labor force. So they need to be near a pool of talent. They need to be near a constantly renewed pool of skilled labor. Only certain regions in the world manage to do that. Hollywood managed to do that. It's a concentration of stunt artists, a concentration of musical score writers, it's a concentration of script writers, and even though, of course, it's also run by economies of scale, since the major Hollywood studios grew larger and larger and larger, so that Los Angeles is in a way a kind of hybrid of the two. It's based on economies of scale, but the region as a whole operates with all the smaller firms that rent equipment and fix equipment and small firms with stuntmen that design stunts and so on can also proliferate because everybody who is in the stunt business, everybody who is in the writing scripts business, everybody who is in the cinematography business tends to move to LA. These regions, the more talented people they have, the more talented people they attract. So what does that mean? That they nourish the region with talent. That those regions become enriched with creative people. And that pool of talent doesn't go away because it cannot move. There are not that many other regions where they would be able to have so many jobs. Yesterday I gave you a book to read. I didn't write the name because I had run out of space. Annalie Saxenian. The book is called Regional Advantage, and I highly recommend it to you whenever you're in the mood to read about economics, that's all. It compares two regions, Route 128, which is an industrial hinterland outside of Boston, which had based on economies of scale, and Silicon Valley, which even though it has very large corporations, Intel, Xerox, Apple, Hewlett-Packard, Google, is the place where more startups continuously keep popping up, more inventiveness, and more small businesses exist. And she does, so it's comparative analysis. And she traces that the comparison over 3 decades, because as I told you yesterday, if you made a comparison at a time when things are going well, say the 70s, actually the economy was not very good in the 70s, but more like the 60s, say, where the economic cycle is in an upswing, well, everybody does well in an upswing. So what she did, and very, very smart from her, is to do it a several decade study, so that to be able to get at least two upswings and two downswings, because it is only in the downswings, when the economy is doing bad, that you can see which one of those two regions was more resilient, not which one produced more wealth, because both produce wealth, but which one is more resilient against adversity. Right? And she shows, with all this evidence, that Silicon Valley is witty, it's resilient, it's robust, because of its multiplicity of small firms. So the small firms strengthen the region. They nourish the region. Large firms tend to weaken a region. And if they decide to move, they decide to close their plants, they decide to move to another state because the other state gives them a better tax treatment, they can kill a region. They can kill a city and the towns around. So we have now then, even though I'm right now, I admit that I'm doing this, I just said that Los Angeles is a combination of both, so that we do need to, in fact, to think of hybrids. They should really be seen as a continuum along all these dimensions. Because of course, I'm right now picturing a factory in which every single worker is a routine little robot. But that is an extreme. You know, factories have a lot of routine labor, but they also add some skilled workers at certain key positions, and then some of the supervisors are also skillful. So clearly, routine and skilled are just two extremes of a continuum, and what we want to do is to locate firms along that continuum. Leadership is more of a sharp break, because the moment a firm goes IPO, that is initial public offering, it changes its legal status. Now it's publicly owned, it's not privately owned, and the law applies in a completely different way to you. But nevertheless, the case of Steve Jobs returning to Apple shows that there can be a mixture there too. Apple is a publicly owned company, has stock, but they brought back the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur is the one who's running the company. Well, that's a mixture, right? That's a kind of a hybrid between the two. Competition can also shade into one another. Oligopolistic rivalry exists when you have 3 or 4. Anonymous competition when you have 20,000. Well, what happens when you have 50? What happens when you have 100? Well, there might be intermediate cases to study there. So it's not a dichotomy. Each one of those dimensions must be seen as a continuum, and we should always think of industrial organizations as a population, right? Like every assemblage that we've been talking about, they always exist as multiplicities. And what we want to know is how the variation along all these parameters is distributed in the population. In other words, for a particular region, is there an average size for the firms? If the average size is always large, well, we can confidently say that that region is dominated by large companies. If the average size is small, we can confidently say that that region is dominated by small companies. And so, for the rest of the things. Now, one of the parameters that Annalise Atsinian finds particularly interesting is what is called a turnover rate. This is where we bring intensive thinking. Remember, all rates are slownesses or rapidities of becoming. The turnover rate refers to how many years on average an employee will spend in a firm. That's all. Right? The turnover rate in Route 128 was about 50 years, because seniority counts in those firms, as it counts in many Japanese firms, as it counts in many German firms, right? The longer you stayed at your job, the better your salary, the better your position. So people don't leave their jobs. People now, once they join IBM, they become IBM people, they become Google people, they become, members of that corporation. They live and breathe the culture of the corporation. The turnover rate in Silicon Valley was 3 years. 3 years. What explains that? Talented people get bored in their jobs when their jobs stop being challenging, when their jobs become routine. So you join a firm, you join a startup, because you have all these new ideas, and it's Skype, and you can believe it is the only one that had the idea of sending free video through the internet. So you join Skype to write a few algorithms to perfect that, or to help with some other part of the product line. But after 3 years, you realize, hell, I don't have anything else to learn here. And my career, not my career, but my talent will now lay fallow, so to speak. I'm going to get rusty if I stay here. I need stimulation. So they move to another job. Now, this can only happen in economies of agglomeration, because if you are in a region dominated by 3 large corporations, like Route 128 was, one, DEC, and Digital, you leave one job only to get a job in one of the other 2 corporations. But if there is thousands of startups, thousands of small firms, you're always going to find a firm in which you're going to find that excitement of creativity, that stimulation to your mind that was the reason why you moved to that area in the first place. So, a turnover rate of 3 years. What does that mean when we pull out and zoom out? Well, it means that there's a constant migration of talent through firms. Engineers are moving from one firm to another, software writers are moving from one firm to another, interface designers are moving from one firm to another, and so on and so forth. And when they do that, they bring with them their know-how. They know that travels by itself because it travels in books. Right? So everything that's knowledge in terms of true sentences that you believe, about electronics, about software, about algorithms, about how a good interface should be designed, can be put into sentences, which can in turn be put into books and travels freely. But know-how, particularly know-how about cutting-edge technology and cutting-edge ideas, travels with you. You are the one who has those skills. And you can teach them to somebody else by example, and that someone else can learn it by doing, but they need you to teach it by example. Which means that with a turnover rate of 3 years, we have a constant movement of talented people through the region, nourishing the region by propagating knowledge throughout the region. Knowledge is not now ghettoized in the R&D laboratory of a large corporation, which may decide, I'm not going to put this product out because it's going to cannibalize my product line. So they may invent something like AT&T developed the cell phone in the early 90s and simply not market it because it's going to cannibalize my current product line. You make them wait. You have ghettoized all your talent in your research and development laboratory, and even the most brilliant ideas, because they do have brilliant ideas. After all, Microsoft, who can remember the last time, with the exception of the Xbox, that Microsoft did actually innovative? I can't. They buy things, like they bought DOS to begin with. They copy things from Apple, like they copy with Windows. Every time they try to come up with something like the Microsoft Watch or something like that, it turns out to be a disaster. Then they begin copying the iPod with the Zoom in a bad, cheapo way, which obviously didn't work. And yet when you look at the people that work at Microsoft, they have Nobel Prize mathematicians, Nobel Prize physicists. I would argue that the talent of those people is being wasted at Microsoft. They probably have incredibly high salaries, and they have stock options, and their options have probably gone through the roof, so I'm sure they are crying all the way to the bank. But as scientists, as creative people, they are not nourishing Seattle in the way in which 100 small firms doing basically the same thing would be nourishing Seattle. So we have then here, I went from an example of couples that you invite to your party because they bring the best out of each other, and couples that you don't invite to your party because they bring the worst out of each other. That was a personal level example. But it's a real example. It's an example from real life. Bringing the best out of each other is precisely that. Enhancing one's and other's strengths and minimizing each other's weaknesses. Bringing the worst out of each other is exactly the opposite of that. Emphasizing the bad points that the other one has and overlooking or even minimizing the good points that the other person has. I went from that example to a much more elaborate one, which is the one I'm giving you here, in which you have to now go through a bunch of explanation before getting there, but it's the same example. It's poisoning versus nourishing. It's enhancing capacities versus degrading capacities. So here we have at least one way of making a materialist ethical decision about economics. I'm not saying that the decisions will be easy. They would be easy if the world was in fact broken down into two separate areas. But if each one of these variables is in fact a continuum, it's going to be like the case with phosphorus. The amount of phosphorus that you add to the soil is a continuum. You can just add 1 more gram, then 1 more extra gram, and 1 more extra gram. When is the critical point at which phosphorus stops being a nutrient and stops enhancing the capacity of the soil to sustain life and starts poisoning the soil and degrading the capacities of the soil to sustain life? It's an experimental matter. We need to actually causally intervene, actually do it, and then you find out. Well, the same thing here. We cannot make a priori decisions and glorify economies of agglomeration and demonize economies of scale. For one thing, economies of scale are indispensable in certain industries, like the electricity production industry, at least prior to the new generation of solar panels and generators and smart grids. But for the last 100 years, you produce cheaper electricity the larger the dynamos, and the more intense the voltage, the cheaper the transmission, so it pays to be big. So what governments do in those cases where you have the inevitability of a monopoly, well, they make it into a legal monopoly, right? Which is good. In other words, they reign over it. That might not be the best solution, but at least governments realize, at least the United States government anyway, realizes that to have Con Edison run around and setting its own prices for electricity would be suicidal. So they allow it to be a monopoly because you need economies of scale because of the technology, but you reign on it with regulations. And that dependence on economies of scale by the electricity producing part of the economy is actually contingent on the development of the economy. I mean, on the development of technology. With a smart grid and plenty of solar panels, such that people could sell electricity back to the grid. You know, you produce your own electricity with your solar panels. You use electricity for your house, but you have excess electricity. If you have a smart grid, and everybody can become an electricity producer because you can sell back electricity to that smart grid, then that monopoly is going to become obsolete. And hopefully, governments will have the sense to just close them down or force them to compete. Nevertheless, for a certain development of technology, sometimes economies of scale are inevitable. So we have to take that into account when we make our ethical judgments here. Nevertheless, and this is a distinction, as I was saying, that Rogel makes between capitalism and the market economy. Clearly, it is in the interest of most governments, not only of first world governments, but all governments, to promote industrial parks, industrial areas, industrial hinterlands based on economies of agglomeration, because number one, they cannot move away. So it's not as if they could send their labor they could outsource their labor to other countries. They cannot move away physically from where they are because that's where the pool of talent is. So they are nourishing the soil. They don't have enough economic power, or rather, they don't have large enough size that they are too big to fail. We talked about that yesterday. Being too big to fail, to me, is almost synonymous as that firm is poisonous for this society. Right? You're saying, yeah, get bigger and bigger, but if you fail, we cannot let you fail. As I said yesterday, that means you're going to privatize profits and socialize losses. That's a degradation of us. We end up paying for their mistakes, and then they keep giving themselves bonuses even after they make those all horrible decisions. How could that not be unethical? Not immoral, unethical. There's an actual objective degradation of the population there. So, to close the class, Deleuze, in his two books on Spinoza did many things. I'm just taking one aspect of his work. The ideas that I use for topological thinking, singularities, and changes from one distribution of singularities to another, he had already seen that. He thought of God as a monosubstance, as one matter, animated from inside by diagrams. He didn't use the word attractors and bifurcations that come from topology, because topology didn't exist, but he used the words attributes and modes, which if you read carefully can be paired quite nicely with the modern notion of phase space with singularities. Singularities would be the modes, the changes between different singularities would be the attributes. So we're talking about somebody who in the 17th century, in his anxiety to be able to think philosophically about a God that is not personal, therefore cannot listen to prayer, and it's a God that is not transcendent, doesn't exist, independent of matter, but it is impersonal and immanent. In his effort to be the first one to think about a deity that is immanent and impersonal, he came up with many of the concepts that we are using today in this class. Even though I'm drawing them from mathematicians that existed 200 years later, when you read Spinoza, you feel like he stole your ideas through a time machine or something. I mean, this guy must have traveled to the future, see this stuff, because how could he possibly have seen all that when he wasn't even a teacher in the academy? He ended up his life, after he was excommunicated, as a glassmaker. He ended up his life intervening causal in reality as a craftsman. Right? Yet he saw that. So I highly recommend Deleuze 2 books on Spinoza. They are written in a completely different style than 1,000 Plateaus, no jargon whatsoever, perfectly clear prose. And he's trying to recover Spinoza for us as a significant source of a new environmental ethics, but also an ethics that can be extended to the many different senses, many different meanings of the word environments, social environments, private familial environments, communal environments, organizational environments. What increases the capacities to affect and be affected in their environment? What decreases the capacities to affect and be affected in their environment? It's an ethics of everyday life, but also an ethics that is also a politics, the moment you start applying it to organizations and cities and so on. Okay, guys, maybe time for some more questions. A few questions, and then we're going to have to go to dinner.
Very quick one. Did you write about that? The last part of your lecture?
Yes. Did I?
I mean, did you write about that in one of your books?
Yes, I wrote about that in 1,000 Years, but we also talked about this yesterday. That's why you're getting a sense of deja vu.
No.
Because yesterday I introduced this kind of sideways without explaining it correctly. It didn't belong to the class yesterday. Or actually it did belong to the class yesterday, because yesterday was economics. It's just that I ran out of time yesterday. Right? So I couldn't give the step-by-step definition of this thing. So, but yes, the distinction is from Rodel, and I used it in the book 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, chapter 1. Yes, guys? No? Satisfied? I mean, it seems like a good point to stop, right? We ended up with something that is applicable to everyday life, some kind of ethics that we can actually, think at least apply to our lives and to our careers. And I think it's a good scale at which to end the class, the personal scale.
Right, I'll ask the question. There's one roundtable discussion, I don't know if you're familiar with it, about losing politics, in which you are accused of reducing all problems of capitalism to big business. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that I'm not the one who does that. It was Fernand Braudel. Right? It's not as if I had come up with that idea. I wish I had come up with that idea. It's Fernand Braudel who does it. But before anybody bitches about that, I would want him to read those 3 volumes. Because that is Braudel. Right? Braudel is evidence. Chapter after chapter after chapter. Right? It's not just some theoretical abstract thing about words. If capitalism is this, if capitalism is that, right? It is actual people who went to actual bank books of Florentine banks in the 14th century and added the numbers. It's people who actually follow the flow of silver through Genoa into Spain and so on. It's people who actually follow the flow of sugar, the flow of salt, the flows of grain in detail. When you start going through Braudel's books, there's all these maps with all these catchment areas for different commodities. If someone has read those 3 volumes and then says, I'm going to attack this because it's reducing capitalism to big business, well, I would listen to that person because he saw the evidence and was not convinced by the evidence. But if it is just somebody out of nowhere who happened to have his own pet theory of capitalism,
I don't think in the discussion they reduce. They disagree with the reduction of capitalism to big business, but they say the Landa reduces the problems we have in our current economic environment, which we call capitalism for now. He reduces those problems to big business. That's, I think, the point.
Okay, well, I would say...
I don't have an opinion on this, but I'm asking for yours now.
I would say, look at what happened in 2008. Mm-hmm. That's our problem right now, what happened in 2008. Right? We don't have any other problems because... Trump accusing Obama of not being born in the United States, that is not a problem, right? The problem is, if you're so rich, how come you cannot do anything about the awful hair that you have over your head, right? That is a real problem. But in terms of the problems that we all have, I'm sorry, I just have to say that because I hate the guy. The real problem that we all have right now, particularly you guys, because you guys are graduating, and with an unemployment rate of 10%, 13%, 15%, what exactly are your prospects to get a job? So it is your problem. So what is your problem? It began in 2008 with a bunch of firms that were too big to fail. In other words, our problem, at least the 2008 problem, is big business. That is our problem. If you don't like the phrase big business, then just say the disproportionate accumulation of economic power. That would be a better word. Because when you say big business, it seems like a pop economy term. Right? But the real problem here is the disproportionate accumulation of economic power, the pricing power, having the power to routinize labor and therefore to change workers like gears. Because if you can do this routine, anybody can do your job. Therefore, your job is not secure. When you're a skilled worker, your job is secure because it's very hard. It's going to be very hard to find somebody with those skills. You're going to have to train somebody with those skills. So our current problem is big size. And I was saying that since 1997 with my book. Did anyone listen to me back in 1997? No. We had to wait 10 years later until those predictions came out true. Look at the book. I have the phrase,
I've read it.
Privatizing Profits, Socializing Losses. You know, I was already thinking about this, and then it actually happened. Right? Now, whether there are many other aspects of economics that that are problematic and that we should think about, I completely agree. I mean, in that particular book, 1,000 Years, because there was going to be one chapter on economics for the whole millennium, and then there had to come a chapter on biological aspects, the ones that we talked about this morning, on food and diseases, for the whole millennium, and then I had to do linguistic history for the whole millennium. Clearly, the chapter on economics was shortchanged. It's inevitable. You know, as I was writing the book halfway through it, I was thinking, why didn't I say 500 years of nonlinear history? 2 weeks of nonlinear. No, actually, believe it or not, the Zone guys didn't like the title. Didn't like the idea that it was 1,000 years. Because people think that what happened before the Renaissance doesn't really matter. I mean, the Renaissance is the Renaissance. Why don't you start with the Renaissance? The previous book, the war book, I started with the Renaissance, right? Because I was stupid. Now, all of a sudden, I was biting way more than I could chew, 1,000 years, and I almost lost it. I almost ended up in the madhouse writing that book because it was way too much time, way too much details, and I wanted to cover economics, biology, and linguistics. So I may have shortchanged the economics chapter. So I would not claim that that chapter is a theory of economics that, for instance, could challenge Marx. I would never claim that. I will one day, if I live long enough, write that book that will challenge Marx. Because until someone challenges Marx with a book that's as fat and powerful as Das Kapital, Marxism for the left is the only game in town. The reason we cannot get rid of it is because there's no real alternative. It's not because everybody hadn't already seen the holes in the theory or the awful dictatorships that that ideology has brought, from Stalin to Mao to Castro to Pol Pot to you name it, Hugo Chavez. It's just that there's no alternative. There's not a coherent conceptual edifice that makes sense of the whole thing, right? Not only industry, but trade and finance, services, to cover many different organizational forms like the franchise. You cannot examine McDonald's unless you examine the organizational form we call the franchise. Do I do that in that book? Of course not. Are there problems with franchising? Of course there are. It's a homogenization. McDonald's, for instance, is promoting the genes of the Burbank potato because everybody who opens a McDonald's franchise everywhere in the world has to sign a contract that says, I'm going to make my French fries with Burbank potato. What does that do to the potato gene pool? Well, it's not pretty. We need variation in the potato gene pool. If you homogenize the gene pool of a monoculture, you simply are opening windows for microorganisms to come in and destroy the entire crop. Natural variation in crops is what allows them to be robust against attacks by microorganisms. You think that you found the best genes, and now you're going to clone them all and plant a bunch of clones. Well, you might as well, irrigate them with viruses and bacteria. I mean, it's as crazy as that, right? So I still have to write my political economy, but believe me, it's not going to be as if we had to start from scratch. There are all kinds of economists that have been forgotten by history because they were not either right-wing or left-wing. For instance, Kenneth Galbraith. John Kenneth Galbraith is right now forgotten, but he was a very famous person who was alive in the 50s. He was an ambassador in India. He hung out with generals and so on. He was like
Just died a few years ago.
His books are fantastic. The New Industrial State, money, where it comes from, where it went. He has a history of money. He has a history of industry. He's the first one, as a matter of fact, way before Brodel, who said that economies of scale were socialist, that it was a planning system, that this had nothing spontaneous about it, nothing of the spontaneous self-organizing order of the market. He called this, in a book called The New Industrial State, he called this the planning system, just to stick it to the Marxists. Right? So we have, and John Kenneth Galbraith is only the most prominent member of the School of Economics that used to be called the Old Institutionalist School. It goes back to Berlin at the end of the 19th century and has a bunch of brilliant people that are totally forgotten, totally neglected. Then comes a new generation after Galbraith, the neo-institutionalists, Oliver Williamson, Douglas North, who are taking institutions, organization into context. They are taking the interaction between firms and government into consideration, are designing a completely new view of economics, and we could use them. Do people read them? They are, because they are not one side or the other. They're kind of in the center. They are pragmatists. But we could rescue the work of these people, combining with all the data from Brodel, and create something that is really a real challenge, to Marxism, at least from the left, right? At least for progressive politics. Right-wingers, I don't see how you can convince those people of anything, because they don't really even think, and they're getting dumber and dumber, right? With like the Tea Party, and shriller and shriller. I mean, have you noticed? I was telling you yesterday. There's always dogs outside Tea Party conventions. That's because Sarah Palin's speech gets so high in tone. She'd be saying, "I can see Russia from my backyard." Everybody knows that she's saying yard, but you can't hear it anymore. But dogs can. Dogs think it's like a dog whistle or something. And that was another cheap shot. I don't even know where it came from. The point being is that I'm not interested in convincing right-wingers of anything. But I am, I know that there's still a very strong progressive movement in Europe, in the United States, in the third world, in general, that could use a new political economy based on a new ethics, based on a new materialism, and based on a new analysis in which you don't think of the capitalist system as a monolithic thing. As long as there's wages, and as long as there's money, and as long as there's commodities, it is the same thing. Well, it is not the same.